Firstly, I would say that the opinions represented in this video are mine, largely formed from my tactical and practical experience that started in the Army in 1984. There may be people that share my opinion. There will be people that certainly don't agree with my opinion. But my opinions about movement and shooting are my opinions. And I would also say that bottom line up front, movement is a tactic. Movement in any of its forms as it relates to things that we would typically see in firearms related roles, tactical entries, the self defense use of a firearm. That type of movement is a tactic. It's not a shooting skill. Shooting is a separate entity and a skill, and the movement portion of that is a tactic in any of its forms. So I would say that words absolutely have meaning, and the way we use those words convey a specific meaning. I would say that there is shooting while moving, moving and shooting, moving then shooting, and shooting then moving. The first tactic I would reference is shooting while moving, and most likely this is best suited to a competition world where speed is more important than accuracy in many cases as these sports have evolved. The bubble could tilt one way or the other, but the other end of the spectrum, accuracy or speed, will absolutely suffer. The second tactic I would look at is moving and shooting, most likely suited to tactical teams or more than one police officer working together, but it's certainly not limited to just those roles. Movement is the priority and the speed is deliberate and not faster than you could effectively identify and engage a threat. The first tactical consideration is the movement part. To stop the movement in a tactical team could absolutely cause a traffic jam where we don't want a traffic jam to be. To be able to bring more guns into the fight, to get more people in to solve the problem, the movement is the priority. I also very firmly believe that the weapon system doesn't matter. The shooting part is separate from the movement part. There may be a required technique to be able to effectively engage with that weapon system. But that concept is not just limited to tactical teams. It could very easily be two church security team members. It could easily be two armed educators who just happen to end up in the same place at the same time with a requirement to go through a threshold and solve a problem. If the movement stopped, if the tactical consideration of movement stopped, the same traffic jam could cause the same problems in a different setting. A parent, during a violent home invasion, forced to move to the other end of the house to protect their children, might have to consider the same thing from a tactical perspective. Move to solve the problem and be ready to shoot if the problem, if the threat presents themselves. Again, if we're using that first tactic of shooting while moving, the accuracy side of that is absolutely going to suffer. If the tactical movement consideration comes first, the movement cannot be faster than we can effectively identify and engage a threat. I think that what we would most often see taught in civilian defensive firearms training is a version of moving then shooting or shooting then moving, very often confused and often not taught as well as it could be. Very often, it's a dogmatic approach that suggests that movement during the presentation from the holster is a requirement, a get off the X kind of thing. I believe that when we introduce tactics to the basic skilled shooter, they have to be the correct tactics, and we have to teach them when those tactics are most applicable. The appropriate solution is not the same for every individual, and it's not the same in every set of circumstances. They have to be able to decide which is the more appropriate, introduce the tactic first and then the shooting solution, or the shooting solution and then the tactic of movement. In its simple form, in that deadly force encounter, we're presented with a problem with two potential solutions: movement or shooting. To my way of thinking, movement, the tactic, should not be introduced as a dogmatic approach. We should be teaching students how to think and how to problem solve. The movement should be the consideration in that setting to get away from something, to get to cover. And if we're going to use that as an example, we have to also teach them how to properly utilize that cover. To get to a position to clear a backdrop, to get into another space, we have to understand if we're moving into that space to make room for somebody else, or if we're moving into that space for some other reason. But the movement should not just be incidental movement. We should not introduce the tactic of movement in a shooting program unless we also introduce the context in which that movement would be most appropriate. The movement piece has to be critical. Before, during, or after, the movement should be an intentional, deliberate tactic introduced as part of the problem-solving solution. Drills like the Handgun Combatives 9 and 9 drill are excellent drills to introduce the tactic and even some of the technique for proper movement without reducing the importance of the shooting requirement. At almost 60 years old with bad knees, I cannot move as well as I once could. That has to be a consideration for that tactic. Mike Pinone's excellent Mad Half Minute exercise is another drill to illustrate the difference between moving then shooting or shooting then moving and tie it to the individual shooter's capabilities. Do I need to move closer, farther, laterally to be able to get the shot that the shooting solution requires me to be able to make? No matter what drill we introduce, whether it's a box drill, a cone drill, I'm sure there are dozens of different names for that concept. Those could be utilized to work between the three valid in that tactical setting: moving and shooting, moving then shooting, or shooting then moving, to help explain the context to the individual student that best suits their job, that best suits the setting that they might likely find themselves in, to help guide their practice. I've even seen it suggested that the tactic, moving and shooting, is only valid in a military or law enforcement setting. And that's just another example of willful ignorance. If someone carries a firearm to protect themselves or someone else, those three tactics, moving and shooting, moving then shooting, or shooting then moving, are all three valid tactics that deserve a place in their training program.